Hello, I've got David Pyne with me today for our conversation. David Pyne is the Executive Vice President of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. He was also a former analyst at the Pentagon, the Department of Defense in the United States. David, welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be on your show.
Thanks, David. Want to ask you, David, about this security pact. This week, the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky was quite gung-ho about signing a new security pact, a 10-year security pact with the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about this security pact? Is the Biden administration amenable to signing this pact?
It appears they are, yeah. So this security pact is something that Zelensky has been seeking since at least March 2022. You might recall that during the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine and the war with the compromise peace agreement, Zelensky's biggest issue, in fact, was getting U.S., U.K., and French security guarantees that if Russia were to attack Ukraine after the agreement was signed, that they would come to Ukraine's defense, and that's something he's been seeking for 2 years. And at the Vilnius summit, the NATO summit in July 2023. Zelensky did his best to obtain, some kind of membership access plan for Ukraine to join NATO, but he was roundly denied. Basically told in no uncertain terms privately that Ukraine wouldn't be joining NATO anytime soon. All public pronouncements to the contrary, and that if ever. And so this is really his fallback position. This is the best the U.S. is willing to offer, and it's a security pact, guaranteed really on par with perhaps Taiwan that the U.S. has with Taiwan and Israel, meaning that it wouldn't commit the U.S. to send any combat troops or go to war in defense of Ukraine under any circumstances. It would essentially mandate that we continue to provide them military assistance, such as we've been doing. So it essentially is what is attempting to kind of lock in future U.S. presidents to provide military assistance to Ukraine actually not only in the event of a Russian attack, but in perpetuity. And that's something I think President Trump, if he were to be elected president, would not agree to. And while the Biden administration hasn't come out straight away and said that they're willing to sign up to this agreement, I think it's likely that they will.
And would the Congress, the United States Congress, would they have to approve it? Would they have to sign off on it for it to become a reality?
So under the U.S. Constitution, they would have to do that. However, I would think that the Biden administration will claim that they don't. They'll call it an agreement rather than a treaty, similar to the U.S. Strategic Partnership Agreement, which the U.S. signed with Ukraine in November 2021, that caused Russia to invade Ukraine in the first place. Most likely the Biden administration will try to avoid Senate approval in this instance.
I mean, some people would point out that this pact would kind of override a democratic mandate from the people, in that it locks the United States in for a 10-year period or more, and it kind of preempts any presidential choice in the matter. Say a future president, you mentioned Trump there, or somebody after. The implication is that such a pact would take it away from any future president the decision to get involved with Ukraine. It would be a fait accompli.
Well, I think that's certainly the objective of the warmongering imperialist neoliberals and neoconservatives in and out of the Biden administration. But my understanding of the Constitution is if it's not a treaty, then the president, it really isn't mandated to do anything at all in terms of future presidents. So my advice to Trump, if I were his national security advisor, would be to simply you rescind the treaty, rescind the agreement, say, we are not going to abide by this agreement anymore. And typically, these types of, a treaty would have some kind of provision where if one party wanted to leave the treaty, then they have to give 1 year notice, some kind of notice like that. So I'm sure we'll see something like that in this agreement as well. But I would simply advise President Trump to completely ignore the treaty and proceed in accordance with U.S. national security interests, which is not to provide any military assistance to Ukraine at all, and to improve relations with Russia to the maximum extent so we can neutralize the Sino-Russian military alliance against the U.S.
Mm. What does the topic of a the security pact, what does that very topic suggest about the situation of the conflict in Ukraine? I think you made the comment elsewhere that it would suggest that the Ukraine regime is stumbling towards a collapse, and they're trying to wrap up some kind of security pact going into the future to shore up their position regarding Russia. Do you see it as a sign that the Ukraine regime is getting desperate in this war, the conflict with Russia?
Yes, I think that the Zelensky regime believes that Russia's on the verge of a summer military offensive, likely to begin in either late May or perhaps sometime in June. And that such a military offensive, if it had sufficient manpower resources, I think I've stated that I estimate that there's 300,000 Russian reservists, essentially in the Kharkiv region, ready to join that offensive. I think it would break through Ukrainian lines, reach the Dnipro River, and could roll up all Ukrainian forces in southeast Ukraine, much as we saw the Nazi blitzkrieg, invade France and capture, could have captured 500,000 Allied troops. So that would be kind of a death knell for Ukrainian defense, defense potential. That would essentially enable the Russians to roll up all of eastern Ukraine. 45% of Ukraine is located east of the Dnipro River. And my belief is that that's where the Russians would stop. They might shell the capital of Kyiv. But essentially, this has never been about territory for Putin. This has been all about establishing Russian legitimate security interests by rolling back NATO expansion and imperialism. And that he even offered to withdraw to the pre-war borders, essentially, under the Istanbul peace agreement, which was vetoed by Boris Johnson, former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and President Biden. So now, of course, the longer the U.S. waits, the longer Zelensky waits to negotiate peace with Russia, the worse off Ukraine is going to be.
So signing a pact like this, it could end up prolonging or making the situation worse for the Ukraine government by signing this pact. Do you think it would kind of give them a false sense of prevailing in the war with Russia, and would drag the whole conflict out, more deaths, more destruction?
No, I think this pact would actually be a good sign. So Ukraine is actually they've signed this pact with 9 countries thus far, including UK, France, and Germany. With the U.S., that would be essentially the last piece in the puzzle that Zelensky said he needed in order to sign a peace agreement with Russia. So I think that's the objective here. Everyone knows. I mean, it's an open secret that Russia's going to win the war by the end of the year, probably in 6 months. And that the best way for the war to end will be with a negotiated peace agreement that preserves as much of Ukraine's independence as possible in territory. So I don't think this is a threat to peace. I think it actually is a precursor to peace from the Ukrainian side. The issue that I'm concerned with is, the Biden administration has shown no willingness to give up its maximalist and absolutist claim to keep Ukraine in the NATO sphere of influence on the U.S., the U.S. orbit. And so, if that's a condition of the security agreement, then Zelensky may continue to try to avoid peace to the last minute, until essentially Kyiv is falling in the process of falling to Russian control.
Mm. Russia's demand, central demand, would be that Ukraine stays out of NATO, that Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO. So if that's a Russian demand and the Russians insist on that, is this security pact a kind of a consolation prize for Ukraine? The NATO backers realize that Ukraine can't get NATO membership, so we'll give Ukraine some kind of security de facto membership of Ukraine.
Yeah, so this,
NATO,
I wouldn't, I wouldn't say this is like an equivalent to NATO membership by any means, although in some ways it is, because people don't realize that Article 5 really doesn't require the U.S. to send combat troops or defend a NATO nation under attack at all. So I guess in the technical sense it is, but of course the NATO alliance is viewed, Article 5 is viewed as some kind of ironclad commitment for the U.S. to go to war, and it simply isn't. But yes, in answer to your question, this security agreement is essentially a substitute for NATO membership in Ukrainian eyes, because they know it's the best they can get from the Western powers. And so, I think it's a good thing in terms of what the Ukrainian willingness to come to the table. Zelensky, actually, I think it was last month, he said for the first time since September 2022, when he banned any peace negotiations with Russia, that he's now willing to talk with Russia with no preconditions. Obviously, not directly with Putin, but with Russian diplomatic representatives, and I haven't seen any follow up from that. So I think that's just kind of more of a medium to long term expectation. But it's still a hopeful sign that we can move in the direction of peace before Russia forces Ukraine's entire military collapse.
Of course, such a security pact and the others that you allude to with France, Britain, Germany, and I think Finland, it may be a kind of all null and void if Russia pursues and with this military campaign and completely sacks the Kiev regime. It might not even take effect. Could you see that happening, that all this talk about security pacts might be all null and void in the event of a clear decisive Russian victory?
Well, I think from the Western perspective, they really don't care about Ukraine's territorial losses. This is all posturing. All they care about is keeping Ukraine as a kind of a Western satellite or protectorate, U.S. protectorate. And so there was a recent interview, I think it was earlier this month or late last month, with Admiral Stavridis, who is a former NATO commander. And he's very prominent. He's written a couple of novels about future World War III with Russia and China, actually China, I think primarily. But he essentially stated that NATO's going to win, or not NATO, but Ukraine is going to win the war. And then when challenged on potential Russian offensive that could drive to the Dnipro River, he said, even if the Russians captured all of Ukraine east of the Dnipro River, it would still be a victory as long as the Ukraine could hold the Dnipro River line. And that's basically saying, well, if Russia annexed 45% of Ukraine next month, then we could make peace as long as the rump state of Ukraine and western and central Ukraine remained inside the Western orbit, as a kind of a de facto NATO member state as it is today. So, it's very odd that that's really all that the Western leaders care about. They don't care about Ukraine. They don't care if Ukraine is destroyed. They don't care if Ukraine loses half its territory. They don't care if 500,000 Ukrainian troops are killed in an unnecessary and unwinnable war. They just want to maintain, you know, kind of the U.S. empire over at least western and central Ukraine, including Kyiv. So that's kind of their minimum requirement. But sadly, they would rather have that. They would rather have half of Ukraine annexed by Russia, and Ukraine, you know, as kind of a de facto NATO member state, than having a Ukraine that was whole and, you know, united and free of either Russian control or U.S. control as a neutral power. And so that just demonstrates the utter contempt that neoconservative and neoliberal imperialists in the U.S. and the
Yeah.
West in general, the collective West, have for Ukrainians.
Mm. It's kind of refreshing to hear a former Pentagon analyst talking so critically about US and NATO involvement in Ukraine. The way you're putting it there is very critical. It's refreshing to hear a former Pentagon analyst speak in such a way. Um, so, David, if I may put it another way, is this pact a kind of way to make the imminent defeat or victory of Russia? Is it, well, defeat for the NATO side, is it a way of making that defeat look a little bit more palatable, as if it's not really an outright embarrassing, disgraceful defeat, and that they're kind of extracting some kind of, you know, seeming victory out of the conflict, in that out of it they've got this so-called security pact, which really will be nothing. You know, is that a way of putting it, that it could look, it's just a kind of a look, an appearance of something that was gained out of this terrible 2-year slaughter?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good way of looking at it. I mean, look, when the if and when Russia invades, you know, all of eastern Ukraine and drives the Dnipro River and captures tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops, it's going to be a massive defeat. There's no way, like if you know, the U.S. were to you know, to mediate a peace agreement along the you know, current line of control, kind of a Korean War style armistice, as I've been advocating in the national interest since September of 2022, that could be spun as a victory. But if, you know, if Russia were to capture half of Ukraine and annex it outright, or create a buffer state in eastern Ukraine, kind of along the lines of East Germany in the Cold War, there's really there's no icing on the cake. There's no way you can put lipstick on that and make it look good, as, you know, and spin it as victory. So yeah, I think this is one of the ways that you know, NATO leaders would say, you know, try to use to save face, but it really wouldn't fly. I mean, I don't. I mean, U.S. leaders, I think, you know, the Biden administration in particular, they're just acting insanely and irrationally. You know, there's so much talk about, you know, enemy leaders being insane. You know, Putin is described to be, you know, insane or mentally ill or irrational actor. You know, same with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. And maybe that's, you know, that seems more accurate. It's not. You know, these are all rational actors. Iran, all these enemy countries that the U.S. has against, arrayed against it, are rational actors, much more rational, I would argue, than NATO leaders, and in particular President Biden.
Mm, yeah. And this security pack, apart from the look of some kind of gain out of this conflict, but also it kind of seems to lock in long-term spending, public spending subsidy for the military industrial complex. Because in this security pact that Zelensky's talking about, there are long-term partnerships of military industrial production, joint ventures with the United States and Ukraine, and I presume also with the other security pacts with Britain and France, there are these kind of industrial manufacturing partnerships. So from the military industrial complex's point of view, this would be a good thing. They would look at that as a kind of a guarantee of more public money being funneled into the weapons companies.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, which is unfortunate. I'm, you know, still not. I've never really been a believer in the military-industrial complex, at least in the sense that I don't believe it starts wars. but I do think it contributes to prolonging them. And so, certainly their baneful influence on U.S. foreign policy
Hmm.
in that instance. But I think Russia would be fine with a security pact of this nature, providing it doesn't send any more weapons. Small arms, I think Russia would be fine with NATO small arms continuing to flow to Ukraine. But in terms of, missiles, combat aircraft, main battle tanks, they're not going to agree to any of that. So a lot of this agreement was going to be completely invalidated.
Hmm.
Russia's going to force Ukraine to modify these agreements to really take the teeth out of it and just make it, kind of a nebulous security guarantee that in the event that Russia, invades Ukraine again, then they can resume arms shipments. I think Russia's fine with that. But in terms of annual, every year arms shipments, Russia's never going to agree to that. So,
Hmm.
I can almost guarantee that Russia's going to force Ukraine to back out of that.
Yeah. So, David, just to recap, then you're saying this security pact that they're talking about now between Ukraine and the United States, you're saying it as a kind of an indirect sign of the conflict coming to an end, that they're trying to um, salvage some kind of respectable position in a defeated side.
Yeah, if you read the details of the 10-year security guarantees that are being negotiated, it's really alluding to a post-war period. Because essentially there's nothing Ukraine needs to do in terms of security guarantees right now because they're already getting everything they want. They have getting all kinds of arms from NATO countries. So these security agreements really, I view them as kind of starting after the war is over. After the war has been ended with a peace agreement. That's why I
When
view it as a kind of a positive, even though I disagree with much of the substance.
Right. Okay, I get you. And what time frame would you estimate from your information, from your analysis? When do you think that the war would come to an end and would begin a negotiating process?
Yeah, so just in terms of like weather, related situations, we know that the Russian and Ukrainian mud season is kind of it kind of fades away in late April or really just early May, I think, and then kind of resumes, later in October, mid to late October. So I would anticipate the Russian summer offensive would peter out in kind of probably mid-October timeframe, and at that point, Russia would kind of provide its ultimatum, assuming, I think wise Western leaders, if they saw a breakthrough in the Ukrainian lines where Russian forces were capturing Kharkiv, surrounding Kharkiv, for example. I mean, my advice would be to seek an immediate, permanent ceasefire and armistice agreement along whatever lines have been achieved by at that time, because ultimately, I think Putin's very happy to agree to Ukrainian independence for 82% of Ukraine's territory right now, internationally recognized territory. But if Western leaders wait until he's captured half of Ukraine, I don't think he's going to give it up. I think he's going to say, I've been saying all along, I'll accept an armistice agreement wherever the lines are. And so I think if Russian forces surge the Dnipro River, that's going to be Ukraine's new eastern border. And
Mhm.
so that's why it's so imperative that we accept Putin's peace offers now rather than later after Ukraine has collapsed.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you would have advocated negotiations from the very outset. I mean, we're talking about at the end of 2021 when the Russians offered a package, quite a substantial package of a security treaty to obviate any uh, bloodshed, to obviate any fighting, which then erupted in February 2022. But the Washington and its European allies spurned that diplomatic, um, offer at the end of 2021. Now, you would have advocated, I think, that the West should have taken Russia on in negotiations at the end of 2021. Is that right, David?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I've been advocating for a grand strategic partnership with Russia for for like maybe 5 years. I mean, 4.5 years at least.
Mhm.
I've been saying the U.S. should get out of NATO. We should, make it so that if we get out of NATO, then Russia gets out of its military alliance with China, and then we, they can remain allies with China, but it shouldn't be like a full scale military alliance like it is today. And the U.S. shouldn't be involved in a military alliance with the European powers. Then, but the key really is what they offered was very, very productive and very much in the U.S. interest, with a couple of exceptions. In terms of their NATO, Russia-NATO mutual security agreement, that was 100% acceptable and in the U.S. interests, especially with regards to the nuclear provisions, because NATO doesn't really have any land-based nuclear missiles at all. There's no U.S., British, or French land-based nuclear missiles whatsoever in Europe. They have bombers and they have submarines, of course, nuclear missile submarines. But the whole idea is that Putin, he didn't ask for NATO to recede by 1 inch. He merely asked for Western NATO forces, including U.S. military forces, to withdraw from Eastern Europe, dismantle any bases or military infrastructure, including TABM sites that Russia viewed as threatening, and then essentially have kind of a buffer zone, including of especially of nuclear weapon systems, nuclear capable weapon systems that neither Russia or the U.S. would extend its nuclear forces within a certain range or a certain distance of the other's territory. And that's a very good idea that can help stabilize the world and ensure peace with Russia, not only for the next few years, but for indefinitely, I think.
So it must, if I might put it in a crude way, it must sicken you or turn your stomach that, over 2 years of bloodshed, estimates of 500,000 Ukrainian troops, perhaps 600,000 according to Colonel Douglas McGregor, people like that, 600,000, 500,000. I mean, 500,000 lives have been lost in the Ukrainian military side, and that could have been avoided if they had have engaged in negotiations at the end of 2021. Would that be right if I put it like that? It must be very sickening to you.
Yeah, it's heart rendering. I am an ad. Despite I'm on the Ukraine's blacklist. I've been along with 34 other Americans, including Tucker Carlson, Senator Rand Paul, former Congressman Tulsi Gabbard, because I advocated for peace between Russia and Ukraine way back in March of 2022, and I advocated for a popular referendum in the Donbass region. And
Mhm.
looking back, I think the Russians were willing to go without that and simply go back to their lines. But I wasn't real. I didn't realize that at the time. But yeah, it's a tremendous tragedy. I mean, we've only seen the humanitarian tragedy on this scale in Gaza. It's been Gaza and Ukraine, but in the West, in terms of the Western world in modern times. And so, um, yeah, it does. It really sickens me the extent to which leaders of my country that profess to care about Ukraine, have really been responsible for this. Because if you look back to a CNBC article that I've been circulating, dated December 7th or 8th of 2021, Putin, came straight out and said it. He said, if the U.S. guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO, I'll withdraw all Russian troops back to their bases, and there won't be an invasion.
Mhm.
And that's why I call this war Biden's manufactured war in Ukraine. It's not Putin's war; it's Biden's war. It's a war of U.S. imperialism, not Russian imperialism. And I say
Mhm.
that as someone who loves America, and I put America first,
Mhm.
above any other countries. But I think putting U.S. first actually would benefit other countries, because we would be less involved militarily. We would be not trying to control other countries. We would be striving for peace. And I support nationalism across the world. So I support the national aspirations of every country to choose their own. Obviously, I'm saddened that much of Ukraine is going to fall under Russian control. But I view that I would rather have that than a nuclear war with Russia, over Ukraine, which there's U.S. has no national security interest in defending Ukraine whatsoever, and it's no threat to NATO because, unlike the neoconservatives claim or the Biden claims, Russia has no desire to invade NATO countries, and he made that very clear. With his his offered mutual security agreement in 2021, which essentially was Russia's wish list. They talk about Russia, Putin being an imperialist. What about his mutual security agreement that Russia was demanding was imperialist? Nothing. There was literally he wanted to keep NATO as it was with 30 countries. He wanted Ukraine as a neutral power, and he wanted to de-escalate the potential for a nuclear war, an unnecessary nuclear war between the U.S. And between NATO and Russia, and that's eminently in the West's interests, and yet they rejected it without negotiation.
Mm. David, we're nearly finished. We're running out of time. I just have to ask you a slightly personal question. I mean, has your personal view of American power and foreign policy changed over this 2-year bloodshed in Ukraine? Have you become more critical of US foreign policy and NATO foreign policy? You've mentioned the word imperialism several times, and that's quite a refreshing word to hear from an American, person. Just let me ask you: has your view on American policy, foreign policy, changed in the last 2 years?
No, I don't think it has. I've been very consistent. My view of Russia has changed, but my view of American foreign policy is not. I've been supporting this type of America first, restraint-oriented foreign policy that's, kind of receding from NATO, withdrawing from NATO, kind of a retrenchment strategy for 20 plus years. I wrote about it as the president of a think tank. It went back when I was in DC. That I wanted to see, a grand bargain with Russia, in which we, resolved all of our differences essentially, and it kind of neutered the budding alliance they have with China. That's always been in the U.S. interest, but I've always been completely opposed to kind of the globalist, neocon and neoliberal, imperialist policies. But you're right, imperialism is a new word for me. I just started using it within the last few weeks. So that's one. It's a rhetorical change, but my view of Putin has changed, and it changed when Putin ordered the withdrawal of Russian troops from three northern Ukrainian oblasts, including Kyiv, and he did so unilaterally without any military necessity whatsoever. And he did that as a sign of goodwill, that Russia was, very sincere about peace and had no imperial pretensions territorially against Ukraine. And so that forced me to rethink, because initially I honestly believed, if you go back to my writings in January of 2022, I basically said that Putin's plan was to make, whether by invasion or other means, to make Ukraine basically a satellite state, and every other former Soviet republic a satellite state, with the exception of the Baltic states. And when Putin pulled back, he withdrew from 35 to 50% of Russian occupied territory. It forced me to reevaluate, and I very quickly found out that every so-called aggression that Russia has committed has been directly provoked either by the U.S. principally, or by Ukraine itself. So that forced me to reevaluate. But so my view of Russia is very different now. I believe that Putin has been very sincere about peace. He proved that during his Tucker Carlson interview. He mentioned that he tried to join NATO. He was open to joining NATO in 2000 and 2002. There's just a whole history of constant peace attempts by President Putin, and I say that as someone who believes that Putin, of course, is a brutal dictator. He doesn't allow any political opposition. He throws political opponents in jail. Obviously, he didn't kill Navalny. I'm glad that U.S. intelligence finally admitted that. But he's an autocrat, just like we have in the U.S. with President Biden. Biden, of course, isn't to the point where he's killing political opponents, but he's getting close. He wants to throw President Trump in prison for life, and in the name of defending democracy that doesn't exist in Ukraine with the Zelensky regime that's very brutal and, it's assassinates its political opponents, he is, kind of following that same lead and, autocratic lead. And so it's not a war between democracies and autocracies. It's a war between, two dictators that are competing for their own national interests. And I think Putin represents Russia's national interests far better than Zelensky does, because Ukraine's national interest is not to engage in an unwinnable war with Russia, in which they lose a lot of territory. They need to realize that there's only one country in the world that can guarantee Ukraine's security, and it's not the U.S., it's Russia. So that's why it's imperative that Ukraine agreed to an agreement that's minimally acceptable to the Russian Federation, to
David
ensure that
Pyne.
Russia never has any reason to ever attack Ukraine ever again.
Mhm. David Pyne, thank you very much for your time and insights. Much appreciate that, and I hope to follow up another conversation with you about America first, and can can there be an American presence in the world without imperialism? Is it possible? But anyway, we'll leave that for another. Would you come on for another chat about that?
Absolutely, I'd love to.
Okay, David, I'll get back to you. I'll hold you to that. Right. Thank you very much.
Thanks again.
Bye bye.
Bye.